Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. My name is Jason. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. I am coming to you from Merrion Square Park in Dublin, and I am in the Oscar Wilde Memorial Park. There's a big color statue of Oscar reclining on a rock. Directly across the street is the American College of Dublin campus, which is also the home where Oscar Wilde grew up. It's a 4-story home, and I went all the way to the top and I saw Oscar's childhood bedroom. We are finishing up our 8-day trip to the United Kingdom and Ireland. We spent time in London, where I met up with Denise Sutton, which you heard last week, and Cardiff, and Dublin, and Belfast. Today, I've been in Dublin doing a literary tour. I've walked past homes belonging to William Butler Yeats and George Bernard Shaw, and I've been to the Museum of Irish Literature in Dublin, which is not too far from the Oscar Wilde childhood home. Shout out to Patrick, who gave me the guided tour at the Museum of Irish Literature. Terrific museum, only about 5 years old, but has terrific multimedia exhibits, statues of James Joyce, Bram Stoker, and copies of their original first editions and other notebooks and work in progress. It's been a remarkable trip. I have really enjoyed my time in Dublin. Got to meet up with an old friend from Doctor Who fandom, Dan O'Malley, whom I've known since Rec Arts Doctor Who for more than 30 years. This is only the second time that I've met him in person, so it was great catching up with Dan again. It's great to have Doctor Who fan friends all over the world, and I've met 2 of them in person on this trip. It is starting to rain. Being that your boy is a native New Yorker, it should be 95 degrees and bright and sunny today here in late August, but in Dublin it is overcast, windy, and rainy, and I'm wearing a hoodie which I bought at the Titanic Museum in Belfast yesterday, the birthplace of Titanic, where the Titanic was actually built. Wearing a hoodie in August is anathema to this native New Yorker, so I'm going to go back to my hotel. Coming up after the break, we're going to discuss Doctor Who The Rescue, the novelization of the Season 2 William Hartnell story, which introduced Maureen O'Brien's Vicky as a companion. The book came out over a year after the untimely death of Ian Marter. This will sadly be the final chance that we have to read an Ian Marter book on this show. My guest this week is someone I've been trying to get on the show for a very, very long time, and I'm very glad to have finally landed him as a guest. That is Jeff from Gallifrey's Most Wanted. You've also heard him and me several times on the Trap One podcast. That's coming up after the break, as I enjoy the warmth of a hotel room to escape from the chilly, rainy Dublin August. Seriously, people, how do you do this? Let's get to it.
You are invited on an adventure across all of time and space, in a completely random order. It's the Police Box in the Junkyard podcast. Jump in the TARDIS with your hosts,
Eric Gulbranson,
Asad Kheshki,
and
Matthew Kressel.
Explore Doctor Who TV stories, audio adventures, and books, both novels and non-fiction. The Police Box in the Junkyard podcast. It's the entire Whoniverse on shuffle. The Police Box in the Junkyard podcast is a member of the Direction Point network and is available about once a month wherever you find your podcasts. You are listening to the Doctor Who Literature podcast.
So my guest today is the same person who was my guest yesterday, and this is longtime listeners of this show are very well aware that one of my 2 cats, Smudge, essentially lives on my keyboard. I live in New York. My guest lives in the UK. Smudge lives on my keyboard. I record on Skype, and you push a button that says Start, Stop Recording, and the mouse cursor remains hovering over the button after I press it. About 3 minutes into yesterday's recording, and Skype also records the video, so I can literally watch the moment where this happened, Smudge jumped over me, landed on the keyboard, and her paw clicked on the stop recording button, and because she then proceeded to sit on my keyboard blocking my screen for the next several minutes, I did not see the pop-up flag on my screen that said recording has stopped. So We had an amazing conversation that went on for over an hour, and we only have the first 2 minutes and 36 seconds of it preserved. So today, Saturday, we are recording again. And my guest is, of course, somebody I've been trying to get on the show for a very long time, and we finally managed to get a date today for the rescue, and that is Jeff from Gallifrey's Most Wanted. Jeff, welcome. Well, not welcome, but welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me back and having me here for the first time.
Twice.
Yes, I've never done a repeat appearance on a podcast quite so quickly, I don't think.
We are, of course, looking at a limited time because I will be releasing this episode in less than 24 hours.
Oh, right, okay.
So I thank you very much for agreeing to do this twice. As you sip from a world's best dad coffee mug, let's talk a little bit about you first. I was not really much of a Doctor Who podcast consumer until the pandemic. 2020 kind of changed everything. I had already been a recurring guest on Trap One at that point. 2020 is when I did my first guest host stint on Trap One. Then I had been on a couple of episodes of Reality Bomb as a background voice, and I had done an episode of the Doctor Who Target Book Club. Didn't have my own show. Through Trap One, I started learning about the existence of other shows that I wanted to give a listen to. So, and this is back in the day, I would physically download episodes from the podcast provider and transfer them to my phone. This is before apps made things a little easier. So I listened to you and Ross on Runcible Report, and I really enjoy the talk show format that you guys had, and I kind of sort of borrowed it for the interview portion of Doctor Who Literature, which came around a little over a year later. So one of the things I quickly learned about you is that you have an enthusiasm for the William Hartnell era that is at least equal, if not greater, to my own. And you have a particular fondness for the rescue, which is why I invited you to talk about the rescue today. You also have an incredible enthusiasm for the Jodie Whittaker era. You and I last month recorded a Trap One episode, and I invited you on to talk about the rescue. What I didn't know is that because I have a 6-week podcast backlog of my own, just this past week after returning from the UK, I listened to you and Ross and Melvin on Gallifrey's Most Wanted talk about Empire of Death. And you mentioned at the end of the hour that you were going on yet another podcast to talk about the rescue. So you appear to be the internet's official go-to guy for the rescue.
I think people become synonymous with certain episodes, be that their first episode, and they kind of claim ownership of it to a degree. And I think that that has organically happened with me and the rescue. It's either me and the rescue or me and the Ghost Monument, two of my favourite stories, which actually I would heartily recommend to anyone after watching the rescue. Just go and watch the Ghost Monument afterwards. They really kind of complement each other in a very cozy, warm, secure Doctor Who hug kind of way.
That is what the power complex. Sorry, I'll say that again. That is what the God complex is for me. That is my comfort new series viewing. Not just because it is a backdoor sequel to Horns of Nimon, but because the claustrophobic format and the limited guest cast, everyone who dies in creative ways, is very reminiscent of the classic series for me. And having been a classic series fan now for exactly 40 years coming up in November, the classic series is kind of like my personal language in a way that the new series has yet to become.
Hello, Smudge.
We are, by the way, recording this episode twice. We are recording on Skype and on Audacity on our own computers at the same time. So this cannot possibly fail.
Once bitten, twice shy.
Was the rescue your first Doctor Who story?
No, not by any stretch of the imagination. I was probably 10 years a fan by the time I got to see the rescue.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I started watching in 1980 with the Leisure Hive. It is my 44th anniversary this month. Yesterday, I think, or today. It's one of the two. It's the 30th or the 31st of August was the transmission date in 1980 of episode 1 of the Leisure Hive. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly, and I haven't got the old program guide to hand. I've only got the modern era. But yes, I first saw The Rescue on a tape that my dad had recorded for me via a friend who had access to UK Gold, which I didn't, and nor did anyone in my family. And I got The Rescue and The Time Meddler on one tape. So that I was always looking for more Hartnell stuff though, ever since I first saw the Daleks.
And when did you first see the Daleks?
That would have been my 12th birthday. The morning of my 12th birthday, I first watched episode 1. I got the double VHS release. People will remember it, the two-tone VHS releases. Same covers, slightly different wording on the backs. But yeah, it was 2 individual cassettes rather than the big fat double packs that we then would get a little while on.
Right, I had some of those double packs on my shelf before I purged my VHSs.
When I first got back into Doctor Who in about 2001, 2002-ish, I was going through radiotherapy at the time, and I made the conscious decision, there's something missing in my life, and the thing that's missing is Doctor Who. And so I got the Frontier in Space because I'd never seen it, and I was desperate to see it. I got the Frontier in Space, the double wide pack. So that, yeah. But I had the Tom Baker years that came in a double wide pack. I loved all of those releases. Genesis of the Daleks and the Sontaran Experiment. That was another favourite. But the Daleks I got on my 12th birthday. I watched the first episode and then spent the rest of the day at school obsessing over what I had just seen. I'm just itching to get home and watch the rest of it. It captured me in a way I couldn't describe.
We had talked about this yesterday. So yesterday was August 30th, Friday. And it does turn out, I went to the fact machine, which I brought back from the UK after bringing it over for my trip. The fact machine did confirm in between recordings that the Leisure Hive did air August 30th, 1980. So you inadvertently revealed your age yesterday. You are a little bit younger than me. So you would have been much younger than I was when you started watching Doctor Who. So the Leisure Hive would have struck you at a very young, very impressionable age. But you obviously remained in Doctor Who fandom for long enough for the first Hartnell stories to come out on VHS in the UK, which would have been, I guess, in the very late 80s or very early 90s.
I mean, my first VHS was Day of the Daleks, and I bought that in 1986 when I was 9. Because I'm a December baby, so now you can hone it down even more accurately as to how old I am. I was born between the transmission of The Deadly Assassin and The Face of Evil. I was born in that break between those. So the Christmas break for Doctor Who. That was my spot.
I was born during the hiatus between what would have been the Green Death and the Time Warrior. So I was born at a time when Doctor Who was off the air for half a year, but I was born on the studio recording day for a particular season 11 story. And in the interest of listeners not hacking my personal identity, I won't say which story it is, but I very strongly identify with the story that was recorded on the day of my birth. So,
oh, wow.
Doctor Who does have a connection for us that way. So I told you yesterday a truncated version of my Hartnell origin story. I mean, I came into the show in 1984. I was already 11 years old, and my local PBS station was airing Doctor Who 25 minutes a night. And my friends then, who are still my friends today, John and Stephen, were urging me to watch this show because they knew that I was a Star Trek kid and I would have really dug Doctor Who as well. So I turned on for what turned out to be part 1 of Time Flight. And I later learned from BroadDWcast.com that Time Flight would have aired on November 23rd, 1984, quite coincidentally, Doctor Who's 21st anniversary Not that I would have known it at the time.
Nope.
And I watched 45 seconds of Time Flight where there's no dialogue, and I turned it off out of boredom. Came back a week later for Arc of Infinity Part 2, where the cliffhanger really grabbed me. And then, I watched a little bit here and there. By the time Enlightenment Part 1 came around, that cliffhanger, where the window opens and we're in space, which RTD shamelessly recycled for Voyage of the Damned in the cold open.
Mm-hmm.
That was the moment that there was no turning back. I have not voluntarily missed an episode of Doctor Who since Enlightenment Part 1 would have aired on my PBS in December 84. But being in New York, I had access to 5 different PBS stations on our 30-channel cable system. So I was getting PBS stations out of Boston, Long Island, New York City, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So 1985 is a magical year because that's when the syndication package comes over for Pertwee earlier in the year. And then Hartnell and Troughton, the syndication package comes up in September 1985. So my first Doctor Who convention, I convinced my dad to drag me to, or I had to drag him to the Roosevelt Hotel, a victim of the pandemic, no longer open for the public, on East 45th Street in Manhattan, July 27th, 1985. And they were airing for the first time omnibus versions of Dalek Invasion of Earth and The Seeds of Death. Needless to say, my father was very, very bored by this convention. So he left me alone, an 11-year-old child, in the hotel ballroom as they are showing a 2.5-hour omnibus of Dalek Invasion of Earth. He grew up in Brooklyn in the 1950s. And at that point, every Brooklyn kid had 2 obsessions, baseball and science fiction movies. At this point in time, the Venn diagram for those 2 things are 2 mutually exclusive circles in the 2020s. Back then, it was a single overlapping circle. So he was into 1950s sci-fi. The reason that we had cable is so he could watch old 1950s sci-fi movies airing as filler at 3 in the morning on out-of-town stations, like WGN out of Chicago. We were early VCR adapters, so we could actually stay up and record the movies and edit out the commercial breaks. Parenthetically, one of my earlier jobs was to sit there for The Blob, the Steve McQueen movie, edit out the commercial breaks. I was 10 seconds late coming back to commercial towards the end of the movie because the station didn't have a bumper at that point in the film. And I was never asked to record another movie for him again, having failed in my task. But after spending an hour and a half chock full of nuts loading up on coffee, he comes back to the hotel, stands in the doorway of the ballroom, watches the last 10 minutes. Now, the last 10 minutes of Dalek Invasion are very emotional. You have Susan saying, being kicked out of the TARDIS. The Doctor gives a speech. I'm sitting there, sniffling up. He then pulls me out. We don't stick around to watch Seeds of Death, so I didn't see that again for years. As we're walking back to Penn Station, he's complaining about how the video quality was so poor. I didn't know about missing episodes. I didn't know about film transfers, BBC Enterprises. He just assumed that I was watching a grainy kinescope from 20 years ago and asked why I liked it. And he never quite got Doctor Who, I guess. He's come to terms with it now because it's been part of my life for so long. But it was a very, very fish out of water moment for him. So I discovered Hartnell very early on, and then of course Unearthly Child airs as an omnibus on New Jersey Network, September 1985. I missed the Daleks the following week because there was a power outage and I physically couldn't turn on the TV.
That's devastating.
But I did watch The Rescue in 85. Then The Rescue comes to my local PBS station. They finally get, on Long Island, the Hartnell package in early 1987. And at this point, I was pulling on my dad, and I was sitting there and I was recording every episode. And by the time The Rescue comes up, this has never happened to me before, and it never happened again for the life of the VHS format. There was a tracking issue with the tape at the moment that I recorded The Rescue, episode 1 and 2. When I tried to play it back, there was this huge static bar across the bottom third of the screen, and it was so loud that you couldn't hear the dialogue. So this is what counts for a tragedy when you're 13 and haven't discovered Girls yet. That was coming soon after. I could watch everything else, all of the other 16 Hartnell serials that they had between Unearthly and War Machines at the time. I was not able to watch The Rescue again until 1990 when it cycled around on Channel 21 for the second time, probably around the same time that you would have first seen it.
Yeah, I guess it would have been 91, 90. Hang on, I was 14, so Doctor Who finished, I turned 13. So, yeah, 1991. Yeah, about that time it must have been.
Let's talk a little bit about The Rescue. I do want to talk about the production history of it because it's fascinating for a lot of different reasons, having to do with David Whittaker's role on the show, Maureen O'Brien's role on the show, the way the show is physically made. But since I've already given a couple of long monologues, let me turn it over to you for one. In brief, what is it about The Rescue that makes this your comfort Doctor Who story?
We talked about this briefly yesterday, but I'm more than happy to talk about The Rescue for hours and hours and hours. There is a very strong fan consensus that although we see glimpses of who the Doctor is and will be throughout the first series, after he's chilled out a little bit, after Edge of Destruction, and they formed a bond through Edge of Destruction, and we start to see the kinder, gentler side of the Doctor, but he very rarely makes choices to actually do things for the benefit of the people in the places and the times that he's visited. He is often escaping from situations, not resolving situations. And the Daleks, he makes that very firm choice to stand and fight because he knows the Daleks, he knows Earth, and he knows it's the right thing to do. And we see the Doctor doing the right thing to do. But The Rescue, for me, isn't about the Doctor's heroic status coming into fore. It is about his character coming into the fore. And we really see the Doctor become the Doctor that we know and love. The kinder, wiser, more gentle Doctor who we want to travel with. And that's very important because there is someone in The Rescue, in Vicky, who desperately needs someone that she wants to travel with because she is stuck with Bennett, who is not a good travelling companion, and even worse in the book by all accounts. So it's having the Doctor arrive and the Doctor be this charming, sincere, whimsical, kindly figure that we've not really seen before, but we recognise as older Doctor Who fans who got into Doctor Who from a later point. We recognise that Doctor very clearly because that's the one we've all grown up with. And to see that come to the fore for the very first time in The Rescue, it's just magical. It is an absolute gem of 2 episodes.
You raise a great point about the role of William Hartnell's evolution as the Doctor, because he starts off as the antagonist. It is basically Ian and Barbara's show. He is the vehicle by which they travel through time, but he is not happy about it or them. It is not until, as you say, the end of Edge of Destruction that he shows any sign of kindness to them. In the middle of Marco Polo, his character distinctly mellows out. And then one of my favorite moments is episode 5 of Keys of Marinus, a Doctor Who is made year-round. We think of season 1, thanks to the program guide, as a single broadcast entity going from Unearthly Child to Reign of Terror. That isn't what it was. Doctor Who was made year-round, and they made, I think, 54 episodes, starting with the original unaired pilot, then the first episode remounted. They had to remount the second half of the Daleks Part 1, so they essentially recorded that twice. And then Season 1 as a production block also includes Planet of Giants and Dalek Invasion of Earth, but not the 3-part version of Planet of Giants. It's the 4-part version. When the decision was made to hold that over to open Season 2 as a broadcast entity, they realized it was too boring to open the season. So they cut out half of episode 3. They cut out half of episode 4. They stapled the halves together, credited 2 directors at once. They threw out the remaining footage. Fandom for decades didn't even realize anything was missing until the Terrence Dicks novelization comes out. He's working from the camera script, and he manages to reinstate the missing material. And Doctor Who fan being Doctor Who fan, what do? We go back for the DVD release in 2011, and we recreate the missing footage, even though it was too boring to air, and put it back in.
You can tell it was too boring to air because the edit is seamless. You can't see that there is anything missing at all. So there was clearly nothing missing
except for the comedy of manners with Bert and Hilda Rouse, and then the cat dying. And I'm glad the cat dying was cut out of the canon because we didn't need that. Cruelty to animals should never be part of the show's remit. So the crew is exhausted. William Hartnell is there. If they recorded 54 episodes in 54 weeks, he only gets 2 weeks off. When he comes back for Keys of Marinus episode 5, Ian is put on trial for his life on the planet of fascist murder trials. The Doctor coming back to volunteer to be his defense counsel, for me, is the first stand up and cheer moment in the show. So the way he solves Unearthly Child, the Doctor, is by running away. The way he solves Marco Polo is by running away. Ross was on for the Marco Polo novelization several months ago, and we talk about how Luca Radi changes the ending of Marco Polo for the book. So instead of running away, the Doctor has a much more active and heroic role in the narrative. That isn't how it happened on TV. Keys of Marinus, they solve the problem by blowing up the pyramid and running away. The Aztecs, they solve the plot by opening up the door and running away as the perfect victim is sacrificed and murdered bloodily by Totoxel. So season 1 of the show, the TARDIS crew always barely escapes with their lives, which is not going to sustain 61 years of television. Now, David Whittaker leaves after a year that aged him prematurely. You look at his publicity photos taken around that time, he looks 20 years older than he is. He's a young radical in his mid-30s. He appears to be a 60-year-old man. And, of course, cigarette smoking and alcohol will also do that to you back then. But he definitely looked much older than his years. He has a 6-week break. The cast has a 6-week break, minus Caroline Ford, who's not renewed. David Whittaker appears to rethink the format of the show as he is a freelance writer coming back to write the very first episode of Doctor Who's second season. So I'm going to do with you what I did yesterday, which was sadly lost to the ages. Thanks, Smudge. I have on my computer 3 scripts, and these are from the Season 2 Blu-ray box set. We have David Whittaker's script for Episode 1, and it's a draft script, not a camera script, it's called Doctor Who and Tanny, which was the original name. And Vicky is still called Tanny, but it doesn't have the camera moves, and it's much shorter than a camera script. It's 21 pages for the entire episode. Different dialogue, different scenes, fascinating stuff. I'll get into it in the audio essay after the break when I talk about the book. But I have the camera script for Episode 2, and now it's been retitled from Doctor Who and Tanny to Serial L. So this is scene 30. It is page 43 of the PDF. And after I read this out, tell me how this irrevocably changes the format of the show forever. And I'm having to extrapolate a little because this is an old typewriter, and it's a photostat of an old typewriter, so some of the letters are barely visible. Doctor Who sits in one of the ornamental chairs, his back to the door. He is sitting there quite content and obviously waiting. He stiffens slightly and suddenly and turns his head a fraction, but not looking at the door. We angle to show that Coquillion is standing silently in the doorway. Doctor Who, because they call him Doctor Who in the scripts back then. Come in. I've been waiting for you. And parenthetically, the letter M in the second word come is on a different line than the other letters, because that's how typewriters worked back in the 60s. The Doctor turns and stands facing Coquillion for a few seconds. Coquillion starts in, activates a switch on the wall, and the door slides shut. Doctor Who moves away, indicates the room with a wave of his hand. And I wish I could do a good William Hartnell impression, but I can't, so just use your imagination. This used to be the people of Dido's Hall of Judgment. Fitting in the circumstances, don't you think? There's another camera move. Doctor Who shines his torch in Coquillion's eyes and moves forward. He tears away the mask. And I want to point out to you, Jeff, this is 5 years before Scooby-Doo. Doctor Who tears away the mask. Doctor Who, Mr. Bennett, may I remind you, robes and masks such as these are only used for absolute ceremonial occasions. The Doctor pauses momentarily. Bennett, finished? That is only a page and a half of camera script. It is a delight to read, and I hope for you a delight to listen to. How does this page and a half of camera script explode the format of Doctor Who and birth the modern show that we love today?
This is the Doctor becoming the hero and confronting the villain out and out. And what it's also the Doctor doing is choosing, because he could very easily, when he discovered Bennett's trapdoor, he could very easily gone back and gathered the rest of the TARDIS crew, but he doesn't. He forges ahead and he goes alone to the Temple of Judgment to face and confront the villain.
And he already knows who the villain is, because for the first time in the series history, and this is, I think, a credit to there being a break in the production block and Whittaker having finally 6 weeks to think about what story he wants to tell. The Doctor already knows where they are, and he has local knowledge that nobody else does. By the time we get to season 26, every single Sylvester McCoy, Andrew Cartmel story is predicated on the Doctor knowing more than Ace about what's going on. And he has the plot solved by the second scene, and we have to watch through Ace's eyes to catch up. That's what the rescue is. The Doctor figures out, from the moment Ian and Barbara describe having seen Coquillion, the Doctor has figured out the entire story, but he waits until the dramatic climax to episode 2 to tell us. And we think Andrew Cartmel invented that. Cartmel discovered it, but he didn't invent it. That was David Whittaker right here in this camera script.
I think David Whittaker really is the unsung hero of Doctor Who to a large degree. I think his fingerprints are more dominant over shaping what Doctor Who is, that we, the viewer, receive anyway. What Doctor Who is forevermore. He works some magic through that first season because, of course, he's in charge of huge swathes of the character development and the actual interplay between these characters. We're getting the outlays of the stories from our writers like Terry Nation, but it is David Whittaker that is making them cohesive. And it's that cohesion that turns up again and again and again through Doctor Who's history. We see it in season 19 with our ensemble cast and the fact that each story flows from one to the next. We see that in series 11, and Chris Chibnall has basically took that initial draft idea of Doctor Who that Newman, Whittaker and Lambert came up with and just modernized it. So what David Whittaker has done is basically by finishing being the script editor and knowing these characters so well, and then writing the first story under someone else's instruction, basically under someone else's control, he is making every other Doctor Who writer's life so much easier by just making the Doctor the hero of the piece. And it allows for variable cast sizes, and it takes us away from the ensemble that dominated that first season.
Did you just drop in a takes you away reference?
I wish that was intentional. It's just how much Doctor Who is in me. You see, it just spills out.
I'm going to assume that's intentional. One of the things that Chris Chibnall does in 2017 is he puts a grandfather back on the TARDIS. So you have 4 companions, 2 of whom are a grandparent and grandchild. That is obviously a deliberate callback, and it works. Even though I don't think Ryan was ever given enough to do on the show, I think the relationship between the two of them, as it evolves between their first and last appearances, is just a beautiful thing. David Whittaker, the first script he writes for the show is Edge of Destruction, and that's the show where the Doctor tells Barbara, "You were right, and I am wrong, and from now on I'm going to respect you." When he leaves, the first thing he is given is a contract to come back as a freelance writer and write the first episode of the season 2 production block. He then writes The Crusade, which is an incredibly in-depth, complex historical. He was ghostwriting the Dalek comics. He wrote 2 of the first 3 novelizations, and the 2 good ones. I don't think the Bill Strutton book is that good, for reasons I talked about in 2021 on this show. David Whittaker writes 2 bangers, and he would have come back to write the novelization of Enemy of the World had he not passed away after starting the book. He then is brought back to write Patrick Troughton's first episode. If you're going to reformat the series with the new lead, get me David Whittaker to write it, with some help from Dennis Spooner. He had also ghostwritten, I think, the second of the Amicus films, Daleks Invasion Earth 2150. He then writes Evil of the Daleks. And I am not a fan of Wheel in Space, which is coming up on this show soon, but he is brought back to do for the Cybermen in Wheel in Space what he did for the Daleks in Evil of the Daleks. Does it work? I don't think so, but we'll talk about that later on. And then when the show is reformatted in 1970, and now the show is in color, and it's a more adult format, and it's shot in color, one of the first things Terrence Dix does, and he was the only institutional memory left on the show by 1970, his first thought is, get me David Whittaker. Sadly, David Whittaker's draft of Ambassadors of Death does not work out. Malcolm Hulke ghostwrites it. Malcolm Hulke becomes the David Whittaker of the 1970s. David Whittaker is the conscience of this show for its first 7 years. And have you read the Simon Gurrier book yet? I'm curious.
I haven't. No, I haven't got hold of it. I do want to read it. It is definitely high on my to be read list, but it also has to be bought first. So
Simon Gurrier came to Galley back-to-back years. So one year he did an hour-long presentation about David Whittaker as he was researching the book. I think this is 2023. He actually showed home movies of David Whittaker's wedding. David Whittaker's bride's maid of honor was an actress named Alethea Charlton.
who I adore. I am a member of the Alethea Charlton fan club, fully paid up.
And as an actor before he was a writer, Simon Gurrier tells us many of the artists who perform on Doctor Who in its first season were people known to David Whittaker. So he was not just script editing the show and shaping its evolution. He was also bringing in a lot of the guest cast. And the second year, Simon Gurrier does a panel. This is 2024, so Mark from Trap One was sitting right next to me in the audience. He does a panel on the evolution of serial television throughout the 1950s and how Doctor Who is the perfection of the format in terms of cliffhanger recaps and in terms of radical young directors in their 20s, like Waris Hussein, Michael Imeson, Michael Ferguson. We think of Doctor Who now as old and clunky and cheaply made. Anything but the truth, because in the 1960s, Doctor Who was made in a radical, cutting-edge way. And this is shown to us in the camera scripts for The Rescue. They decide to make The Rescue and the Romans as a single production block. And they also make Galaxy 4 and Mission to the Unknown as a single production block. Because the money was tight, even shooting 2 stories with the same director, they end up reusing the Tristram Cary score from The Daleks for The Rescue. And you can see in the camera scripts where the musical cues by number are seated throughout the scene. So the scene that I read to you is musical cues 14 and 16. And Simon Gurrier at some point showed us the correspondence. I think they had to actually have Tristram Cary mail them his copy of the reels on which the music was recorded because the BBC did not have them in their library. That's my memory of it.
Oh, wow. That's interesting because the Daleks, the Tristram Cary score for the Daleks is really one of the most fundamental selling points of that story, and it sets such a huge weight of atmosphere over the whole of Skaro and that dead planet. It comes alive through his scoring of it, and it's so bizarre, it's so organic sounding in places, and it just works beautifully in The Rescue too. And I think that may be another reason why I adore The Rescue, is because they're reusing that score from the Daleks.
When you and I played 20 Questions yesterday, which sadly has been lost to the ages, The story that I drew out of the randomizer, totally at random, was The Ark, another William Hartnell story, which, by the way, happens to share the same Tristram Cary score as The Rescue.
Yes, it does.
So I have to pull a different story out of the randomizer today. Whether that story is as thematic to our conversation as The Ark, we will find out in about 15 minutes. But I will say that you got The Ark in 11 questions. We'll see if you can break that record today.
I don't know. I'm not good at guessing games. I struggle. The brain's there. It's just not in action.
So Carol Ann Ford gets a raw deal. She has a certain skill set. She is given a series of scripts that don't allow her to use it.
Yes.
She is written out of the show at the end of its first production block. There's a break. Maureen O'Brien is cast to play Tanny, the new companion, whose name thankfully is changed to Vicky. I don't think Tanny is a great name. The first thing they asked her to do...
Lucky was also in the running for that.
Terrible idea.
Yeah.
Vicky works much better. The production team goes to Maureen O'Brien. We'd like you have long blonde hair. We'd like you to cut your hair short and dye it black. What does Maureen O'Brien say in response to that?
She says, well, why don't you just ask Carol Ann Ford back if that's what you want?
I love that. Attitude ended up getting her written off the show the following year once grumpy white guys Donald Tosh and John Wiles show up and don't like this young woman telling them what to do. It's just a breath of fresh air. I love Maureen O'Brien for that. And when she comes back to do the Blu-rays, she is still bitter about the stuff 60 years later, and she's very funny when she talks about it.
Maureen O'Brien is a very small lady, I think is fair to say. She's tiny, bless her, but she is an absolute powerhouse. She is a force of nature. Her Scouse upbringings win out constantly, I think, because you got to be tough to live in a place or grow up in a place like Liverpool. There's got to be an element of snark that comes back at people.
Jim Sangster was telling me this a while back. Scouse in the UK is the equivalent of Brooklyn in the US. It's just synonymous with this particular attitude. And having been born in Brooklyn and having lived here now again for the last 16 years, I try to embody that in my daily life. So Harvey Keitel is being interviewed on British TV last year about being fired from Stanley Kubrick's final film, Eyes Wide Shut. They're filming a scene, and Kubrick makes Keitel walk through the same doorway 40 times. And Keitel goes, enough, ends up getting fired. Sidney Pollack is then brought in to play the same character. Does a very good job with it, but it's a different style of performance than what Harvey Keitel would have given. The British interviewer asks Harvey Keitel, is that the Brooklyn in you, standing up for yourself? And Harvey goes, it's the sense of worth in me. And I've played that audio clip on this show before. Why couldn't it be both? Why couldn't it be your sense of worth and the Brooklyn in you? But Maureen O'Brien has the UK version of the Brooklyn in her.
What was the problem with Kubrick and Eyes Wide Shut?
Well, he was a genius. Mr. Kubrick did some things I objected to. I didn't like. I thought they were disrespectful, and I won't be disrespected by him or anybody. And if any actor can help it, they should help it.
Yeah.
You don't want to get fired.
No.
But I was.
Is that the Brooklyn in you, do you think?
It's a sense of worth in me.
The Liverpool in her.
I think she really does. And I think that's possibly one of the things that won William Hartnell over so quickly, because he was also a kind of take no prisoners kind of guy. There's lots of backstage stories about his irascibility and his ability to, I think Maureen herself says he would guarantee to lose his temper at least 3 times a day. And it became her job to laugh him out of that, basically, and to get him back into focus, really, for what they were doing.
And that is what is great about the Hartnell years VHS, because we now think of Doctor Who as a binge watch notion. You put it on streaming, you start with the first available episode and go all the way through to the end. In the 90s, we really couldn't do that. So the Hartnell years VHS, with links by Sylvester McCoy, directed by J&T, you start off with the unaired version of Unearthly Child. The very next thing that's shown 45 seconds later is what was then the only surviving episode of The Crusade, episode 3. You watch the physical interplay between Hartnell and O'Brien 5 minutes after he's harshing on Carol Ann Ford. It's delightful to watch, and this is lost to us now with the streaming mentality because you no longer watch episodes in jukebox order. But when you watch it in jukebox order on the Hartnell Years VHS, you see exactly how the show goes from night to day because Maureen O'Brien is there.
Yeah. They have a much more grandfatherly, granddaughterly bond than we ever see with poor Carol Ann Ford. I spoke yesterday, and I think I want to express that again today, that I don't blame Carol Ann Ford for the scripts and the direction she was given, because you see her performance in The Pilot and An Unearthly Child. You see her performance in the first couple of episodes of The Censorites. And when she's given the right stuff to work with, she pulls it off wonderfully. She has a very ethereal alien presence and almost wispy in its performance. It's something quite magical when she gets the opportunity. When she is asked to just overreact and scream constantly, which is what that role degenerated into for her, you can understand her frustrations and her decision. And maybe if she'd had a little bit more of the Brooklyn in her, she could maybe have expressed that in a way that Maureen wasn't afraid to do and wasn't afraid to stand up for herself.
And you gave a very good comparison yesterday. I want to ask you to bring it back for this re-recording. This is our Unearthly Child Part 1 of Doctor Who literature. We're doing it a second time, but differently. Compare Susan's actions in The Censorites and the way the Doctor reacts to it versus what Maureen O'Brien does in the Space Museum.
Exactly. In The Censorites, Carol Ann Ford, or Susan, makes the decision to act to benefit the situation. And that decision is automatically chided and brought down by the Doctor. She is told off for doing this. You could say that was grandfatherly protection. But in the Space Museum, we have Vicky leading a revolution with a gang of teenagers against a fascistic overlord regime. And she is celebrated for that, and she is praised for that. And that is absolutely a fundamental difference in the way that the role of the younger female companion, I think, had changed. Where they made the mistakes with Carol Ann Ford, they learned and they stopped, or they didn't repeat them as often or as egregiously when they came to introducing a new companion in Vicky.
I agree. And the way that she just foments revolution and delights in it so much.
Revolution!
She is being allowed to do the things they denied Carol Ann Ford, and she is so good. And she would have lasted on the show longer had not John Wiles and Donald Tosh had problems with strong, independent females. After talking with Ian Potter last week about the nightmare behind the scenes on the massacre, it is amazing that the show survives the John Wiles tenure. He was only there half a year. And because of that, you have The Rescue is one of Doctor Who's highest rated stories ever, much higher rated than the current era, because viewership is fragmented. Instead of 2 channels, you have 1 billion streaming services. The Rescue had much more people watching, considering how much smaller the population was 60 years ago. The Rescue is appointment television. By 1965-66, the ratings have been cut by 2/3. And there are probably many factors for that: fatigue, end of Dalek mania, people realizing that the stuff that John Wiles is putting out is not as appointment. The Massacre is a great episode, but it's not appointment television, the way that Doctor Who was in the Verity Lambert era. But Maureen O'Brien is just I can't praise her performance as Vicky enough, and we could go on all day with that. I want to talk about something we didn't talk about yesterday. Two things, actually. How did you watch The Rescue in preparation for this recording?
Well, I knowing I was coming on, I said to my family, right, what with dinner tonight, I'm afraid I've got to do a little bit of research. And I was very aware that when they discovered that this was not only Doctor Who, but black and white Doctor Who, that a room full of teenagers, my two daughters and their respective boyfriends, this may not go down well. However, I persevered. Now, there was, I will admit, a lot of staring at phones during it. However, they were clearly paying attention, because just a few moments before the confrontation scene, that beautiful scene that we've talked about, my eldest daughter turns around and went, "Is it the guy with the beard?"
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is exactly the moment you want your audience's penny to drop. And I think for me, that also dispels the argument that it's obvious, because I don't think it is obvious that Bennett is Coquillian. I know in the book it is very obvious that Bennett is Coquillian pretty early on.
Right.
But I think for someone viewing this out of context, like we've discussed, and without any other information to go on other than what is presented on the screen, with no real great working knowledge of Doctor Who, they've grown up around it, but they are not fans. It's interesting to see that reaction play out in real time in 2024 with an 18-year-old.
So, The Rescue, as a bit of archival television in black and white, still works 60 years later.
Absolutely, and so does the plot twist.
It's not Doctor Who's best plot twist. Stacey Smith has described it as a murder mystery with one suspect. But it's the brio with which the revelation is carried out, with Hartnell literally Scooby-Dooing, again, 5 years before Scooby-Doo, unmasking the villain. Let's see who we have behind the mask. It's Old Man Bennett from the Haunted Amusement Park. So, I mean, that's great. And the other thing which we didn't talk about yesterday, which occurred to me last night as I'm working on my script for the audio essay about the novelization, the cliffhanger is almost a unique cliffhanger. What is the cliffhanger to part one? It's a literal cliffhanger. Ian is being forced by blades off the edge
Oh,
of
of course it is. Yeah.
And beneath him is this snarling, slavering monster, which in the novelization, Martyr points out, that is what the Coquillian mask is based upon. If the Doctor hadn't saved the day, and if Ian had fallen down the cliff into the jaws of the Sand Beast, what would have happened to Ian?
Well, he probably got licked to death, to be honest with you, because Sand is such a delight. But
but it's a decoy cliffhanger. It is not a moment of jeopardy at all.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. There is, because as much as I admire that split level shot, and I do admire that shot, the first time I ever watched The Rescue and I saw them above Sandy on that ledge, I was blown away. I was like, oh my God, that's really clever, because that's clearly not a single shot. I found that really impressive. At 14 years old, watching black and white Doctor Who, which I was vaguely familiar with, but in no way as familiar as I would later become, I was really blown away by that shot. But it's not a very high drop, which kind of diminishes Bennett's plunging from that same precipice a little bit later.
True.
But still, it makes the point that here is your companion in mortal peril. And I will say, those blades coming out of that wall are far more convincing than the twigs of death in the Keys of Marinus, which is a little bit rickety. They're actually very smooth as they're coming out of that wall.
Christopher Barry as one of Doctor Who's signature directors for its first 20 years, and this is just another example of how he is able to make chicken soup out of chicken feathers. We're now at the point of the show where it is time for 20 questions. So I have gone to the randomizer.net, a website that is a production of the Flight Through Entirety podcast, the show that I mention almost every week but have never been on. I have picked one Doctor Who serial at random from 1963 to the present. Any story, all of time and space, could be the story that I've picked out. Yesterday it was the Ark. Today it is not the Ark. Spoiler alert. You have 20 questions, and I will give either a yes or no answer, and you will figure out what that question is. Yesterday, because Smudge was glued to my keyboard, I couldn't type out the questions as you asked them. So I lost count, and you finished at either 10 or 11 or 12. But now Smudge has graciously moved aside for the time being. She is sitting to the left of the computer, back to me, and I'm sure she'll try to bite me as I type, but we're going to go for it. Jeff, what is your first question?
Is it a classic era story?
Question yesterday, and yesterday the answer was yes, but today you started with the same question, and the answer is no. It is not a classic era story, which we define as unearthly child through survival.
Interesting. Is it a post-2005 story?
Yes, it is a post-2000, and by that I mean post-March 2005, not post-December 2005, so the Eccleston season is fair game.
Okay. Interesting. Is it a David Tennant story?
Yes, that's interesting because yesterday when you were trying to narrow down the classic series, you immediately went to Tom Baker, which would rule out the largest number of episodes. You have asked the same question today, but with the guy who has done more Doctor Who than anyone else, the way that Tom Baker did in the 20th century, is David Tennant in the 21st century. Yesterday the answer was no. Today the answer is yes, it is a David Tennant story. And I want to point out to you, Jeff, you now have a chance to do the full Mark McManus from Trap 1. You can ask any one random David Tennant story title here, and if you get it right, you will be the all-time winner of 20 questions, getting it in just 4. Or you can go methodically and try and narrow it down. But you could go for a walk-off, Hail Mary pass, grand slam home run, sudden death goal, insert mixed sports metaphor of choice here, by going for one single story. And you have the Paul Smith New Who program guide with forward by John Mark Lofficier.
Okay. I could just go for it, couldn't I? I could. You can just go for it. Random. And I've still got plenty of questions left to narrow this down.
Even if you get question 4 wrong, you have 16 more questions to get through.
Okay. Is it Gridlock?
A story near and dear to my heart because it is a sequel to the Macra Terror and it takes place in New York, in Brooklyn. One of the few Doctor Who's in Brooklyn. It is not Gridlock, and I wish it had been, but it is not.
Shame. Okay, is Rose the companion?
You're asking if Rose is the companion, but no, Rose is not the companion in the story that I have in mind.
So I'm now narrowing it down a little bit further. Is Martha the companion?
This is question 6. Is Martha the companion? So far, of your 5 questions, 3 were no's and 2 were yeses. And we are now going to even the scales because, yes, Martha is the companion, so half your questions have been yes. And now we are at question 7.
Because with Gridlock, I was in the right kind of area, possibly.
But I couldn't tell you that because I don't give clues and I don't make things easier for you.
Is it a Dr. Light story?
So by a Dr. Light story, this is a story where the Doctor is only in 2 or 3 scenes because of the demands of production. So an example of a Dr. Light story is a story like Turn Left, or an example of a Dr. Light story is Love and Monsters. I am not as up to date with the behind the scenes production values of the Martha Jones season, but the only Dr. Light story that I can think of in that season is Blink. So this is not a Dr. Light story. In other words, it is not Blink.
Okay. Does it feature Daleks?
Does it feature death? So now you're trying to go to another Doctor Who story set in the Five Boroughs, and that would be Daleks in Manhattan / Evolution of the Daleks. So if that's your question, the answer is no, it is not Daleks in Manhattan, which is Russell T Davies' love letter to New York City, regardless of the relative merits of the story. It is a comfort story for me because it does New York so well, but sadly that is not it.
Does it feature the Master?
And now you see what you're trying to do is you're going for the signal moments. Is it Blink? Is it the Dalek 2-parter? Is it the Master 3-parter? You're trying to narrow down by going to the highlights of the season first. But the Master is not in this, and that's 3 no questions in a row.
That is interesting. Okay.
Now you're at question 10. You're almost going to beat yourself from yesterday if you keep on with your current train of thought. I think we've eliminated just about half of Martha's. And now, of course, that doesn't rule out it being a story from the next season where Martha has some cameos.
Yes, that's very true. But I'm feeling Martha heavy. I'm feeling Martha vibes.
You're trying to read my poker face, and I will point out that in the loosest sense of the term, I am a professional poker player, having won 2 online cash tournaments.
And you have got a very good poker face, I will say. Is it Human Nature, The Family of Blood?
And what you're doing is you're going to the highlights of the season because you are going for the 2-parters. You're going for the stories everyone remembers. You are not going for something like The Doctor's Daughter. You are not going for some sad, forgettable trifle like the Shakespeare Code. You are going for the big stories of the season. And you have a streak of 3 consecutive no's, but I will point out that you have now beaten your score from yesterday.
Yes!
The final answer is yes, and it is Human Nature, Family of Blood. And the winner is Jeff with an assist to the Paul Smith program guide that you have in your hands.
I will admit my knowledge of what comes in which season is sometimes a little bit shaky when it comes to modern era Who, and I will point out I did it with no assistance yesterday to get down to the arc, but it did take me one further question.
Interesting. So when you have help, you do a little better. That happened to me once and only once. I was playing 20 questions with Mark, and I had to edit it out because it was a new series story, and I had the wrong combination of factors in my head, and I had to remount and pick a different story out of the randomizer, and of course Mark ended up winning. But yeah, the new series program guide does not live. I can recite every story from the classic series in order if I'm trying to fall asleep or distract myself, but I can't do that with the new series.
Yeah, I struggle much more. I think as we've got older, our ability to retain those pieces of information that as a young Doctor Who fan you would try and glean information about every story from any possible source.
Right.
It was always about research. I need to know more because where we were in that place and time, we weren't able to flick on the iPlayer and, like you said earlier, just watch from A through to Z. It's Z. I did that for you. I'll make you feel comfortable on your own podcast. Z. There you go.
Z is a character in Pulp Fiction. Z is the letter of the alphabet.
Zed's dead, baby. Zed's dead.
So we are now sadly at the end of our hour together. I am definitely going to bring you back for one of the episodes towards the end of the run where I don't have a guest. And if I do my long threatened Hartnell podcast, where I will do 1 episode a week, starting with the unaired Unearthly, including the remounted episode of Planet of Giants and going through to Adventure in Space and Time. If I do that, I will bring you back for a 4-week residency as one of my rotating panel of guests. But for now, Jeff, where else can my audience find you online?
Well, I'm all over the place, really. I'm like a bad smell I keep turning up? No, it's a bad penny, isn't it? It's the bad
A
smells
bad penny.
you can't
Or
get rid
Michael Wisher in the 1970s Doctor Who, where Michael Wisher is seemingly in every story in season 12 and 13.
I'm not complaining. I love Michael Wisher. I am on the last dregs of what was Twitter, holding out for some of the lovely people there who I'm yet to convince to migrate over to Blue Sky. But I'm there as City of _Jeff.
Since you and I recorded yesterday, the two largest sporting organizations in the world have come off Twitter. Brazil, the entire country of Brazil, which is synonymous with football, has banned Twitter. And Eurovision has, from what I've read online, also removed their Twitter presence.
Oh, wow.
So Twitter is... I got out the second that Elon Musk and Linda Yaccarino decided to give Alex Jones a platform. But after he declared civil war in the UK, I think everyone else should get out of Twitter. Blue Sky doesn't have quite the same vibe for me, and I don't use it as much. But I am glad that I got off Twitter, and I hope that one day you join me in telling Elon Musk what for.
I've done it before, and it will happen permanently at some point. I just have some very good friends there who I can't contact really anywhere else, and that is the only thing keeping me there, because I've made some really lovely friends through Doctor Who and being on Twitter.
I miss that fan community. I miss the interaction. There are some people that I've lost touch with because I am not on Twitter anymore, and I'm not on Blue Sky with quite the same frequency. But it had to be done. It was a necessary deletion for me.
Yes, and I totally understand, and I can't fault you for it. I'm also on Blue Sky, Jeff Goddard on Blue Sky, whatever the biscuit bit at the end is, I don't know. I have got a Facebook. I very rarely use it other than for people to contact me really, but I have got a Facebook, and I will accept friend requests because I'm lovely. And then I have appeared all over the place in podcast land now. I have done a fair few track ones now, and I'm very flattered to be on there with delightful Mark and people like yourself. That's where we really clicked and met for the first time. People like Conrad. We've got some stuff coming up. I'm also occasional member of Gallifrey's Most Wanted revolving family, which is always like home to me. I adore Ross. I adore Melvin. I adored Vic. I had such a good time podcasting with them that it became something that I wanted to do on a regular basis. I've done Hamster with a Blunt Penknife reactions to, well, The Rescue, shock, The Ghost Monument, yet another shock, Power of the Doctor. That was quite a well-performing episode by all accounts. Yeah, I'm all over the place. Just hit me up, say hi, and you'll often see my art getting splashed around, or my figure photos, or yeah.
All right, well, Jeff, thank you for bringing The Rescue to life. After the break, I will be talking about the Ian Marter novelization, which has a lot of interesting features. I will just preview saying that Ian Marter passed away offensively young in October 1986. The hardcover comes out in summer of 87, and the paperback January 88, over a year after Ian Marter died. I was not dialed into fandom, so I learned of Ian Marter's death through the publisher's note, the editor's note at the beginning of the book. And the internet is split on whether or not Marter completed the manuscript or if Nigel Robinson had to go in and add some pages. But it reads very much like Ian Marter in terms of visceral claustrophobia. And he takes a 2-part script and he significantly expands it out, with the part 2 material taking up 84 pages of text. So he definitely has a chance to embellish, and I will explore those embellishments after the break. Jeff, thank you for recording not only once but twice in 24 hours. And fortunately, we do not appear to have a smudge problem on this recording. I have 2 different recording streams going. and I will edit this and put it out tomorrow. Jeff, thank you once again.
Oh, thank you. I will also just point out, Ian Marter grew up about a mile and a half up the road from where I live. And Delia Derbyshire grew up 15 minutes walk from my house. So there you go.
There is a moment in Simon Gurrier's David Whitaker book, and I believe I have this correct. If it wasn't from there, it was from the Paul Hayes book, Pull to Open. Jacqueline Hill and Verity Lambert were both in New York in the early 60s, and they ran into each other, recognizing each other on a crowded Manhattan street, which is a very New York thing. In a city of 8 million people, you're always going to run into somebody you know, no matter where you are. And of course, my mom is growing up in New York at the exact same time with the same beehive hairstyle. So there is a non-zero chance that my mom ran into Verity Lambert or Jacqueline Hill somewhere on a Manhattan street.
Oh my God.
Of course, we'll never know for sure.
We'll never know, but it's nice to imagine, isn't it?
All right, Jeff, I will see you very soon, either here or on Strap One, or perhaps on Gallifrey's Most Wanted.
That would be a delight. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you the last couple of days. So thank you very much for having me on, Jason. I really appreciated it.
Doctor Who, The Rescue, by Ian Marter, with additional material by Nigel Robinson. Spine credit to Ian Marter. Televised as The Rescue. Teleplay by David Whitaker. Televised in January 1965. Paperback release date January 21st, 1988. Target book number 124. Cover artist Tony Clark. From his one previous visit, the Doctor remembers the inhabitants of the planet Dido as a gentle, peace-loving people. But when he returns, things have changed dramatically. It seems that the Didoi have brutally massacred the crew of the crashed space liner Astra. Even now they are threatening the lives of the sole survivors, Bennett, and the orphan girl, Vicky. Why have the Didoi apparently turned against their peaceful natures? Can Bennett and Vicky survive until the rescue ship from Earth arrives? And who is the mysterious Coquillion? The Rescue runs 135 pages of text and in small print. That's a lot of text for a short TV serial, so as with Ian Marter's earlier adaptation of the two-parter The Sontaran Experiment, episode 45 of this podcast, there has to be a lot of embellishment. Marter begins with a 5-page prologue, which introduces us to the crew of the rescue mission, one of whom is heard from on TV as a voiceover, but none of whom are ever seen. Their names are Smith, Oliphant, and Weinberger, the latter of which is not a name typically used in Anglo-friendly Doctor Who mythology. Weinberger is a sandy-haired, craggy-faced, drawling American who likes to chew gum, and who it's suggested may have seen the TARDIS before, page 8. We'll come back to these guys later, but you won't enjoy them. Spoilers. Without going too deep into the prose, which as usual for Marter is dense and atmospheric, if not slightly overwritten, I will say that Marter's characterization of Vicky in her first appearance on page 13 is unique. Quote, "She had huge eyes with fine eyebrows arched high at the outer corners, giving her an air of alert surprise. Her short, cropped hair, oval face, and small mouth suggested Joan of Arc, and her nose was definitely Norman. Her simple, short-sleeved dress and her dirty bare feet made her look even more like the Maid of Orleans. The Joan of Arc comparison is nifty, given that Vicky showed violent revolutionary tendencies during her time aboard the TARDIS, as we've already seen, for example, in the Space Museum, episode 116 of this podcast. Now, there is supposed to have been an infamous oral sex reference in Chapter 1, written by Marter, deleted by Nigel Robinson. I'm not sure where in the book that would have fallen, but Vicky, quote, kneeling almost in supplication before Bennett on page 15 might have been it. Marter also spoils Bennett's eventual role in the story on that same page by having him show fear at Vicky's mention of the arrival of the rescue ship and a, quote, tormenting gleam in his eye On the next page, when Vicky's back is turned, Marder adds the first of several references to the crashed ship's batteries running down. The excess verbiage means that the TARDIS crew's arrival is delayed by page count. The Doctor doesn't get printed dialogue until page 21, which was a dreadful wait when I was a kid, hoping for the Doctor to show up in the novelization as early as possible. For the TARDIS scene in Chapter 2, Marder deletes the Doctor's panic over having slept through the TARDIS materialization. The Season 2 Blu-ray collection has both Whittaker's draft script for Episode 1, still called Doctor Who and Tanny, Tanni, and his camera script for Episode 1, now called Serial L. That line is not on either script, which is probably what Marder was working from, so we can credit the line as probably a Hartnell ad-lib that wouldn't have shown up in the scripts Marder worked from. Marder's description of Coquillian's mask is nearly as complex and nightmarish as the mask itself. This is vintage Ian Marder prose. Quote, "The huge shape lurched awkwardly along the side of the TARDIS and emerged into the flashing strobe of the beacon in a sequence of monstrous staggers. It walked on two legs like a human, but its horrific head was like the head of some gigantic bird of prey, or some colossal insect combined into an almost mechanical hybrid by an evil genius. Its great globular eyes glowed red, protruding at the end of thick tubular stalks. Its domed skull bristled with stubby antennae, some sharply pointed like probes or stings, others gaping like open suckers. The creature's beak was guarded by two enormous horizontal fangs curving inwards from the sides of its squat, segmented neck. The horny carapace of its body glistened, as if it were sweating a viscous, oily gum." And that goes on for several more sentences. Chapter 3 is faithful to the TV, with lots more adjectives in the prose, of course, but there is a new chapter ender, where the sound of the sand beast, before we've properly met it, gives the Doctor and Ian pause while they're exploring the cave behind the rockfall. Page 37, quote, "The awesome sound had a shrill, cutting edge that suggested the cry of some fantastic mechanical animal constructed by a mad subterranean Frankenstein." Which is one heck of a sentence, just keeps going and adds crazy imagery that the eventual TV sound would never have instilled in you. Chapter 4, page 41, Vicky kneels again, this time before Coquillian. More importantly, Marder adds scientific detail, an explanation for why the native Dido population, Didoi in the book, Didoi, which sounds like an homage to the Time Machine, is so small. The planet rotating around a binary star that causes intense radiation bursts at specific intervals. Vicky adds more detail about the specific functioning of her starship. None of that appears in either of Whittaker's scripts, the draft, or the camera, even accounting for some whited out and taped together pages in the camera, so must be Marder's invention. Marder adds brutality, with sentences like, quote, "A long shadow was cast across her body like an image of death itself," page 38. Barbara, after being pushed off the cliff, has a lacerated face with dazed and frightened eyes, page 42. And the sand beast's lungs, again, we are reading about this before we met the corresponding creature on TV, give off the, quote, "sound of a massive pair of lungs, expanding and collapsing with ominous and relentless power, like a steam hammer in a foundry," page 46. Chapter 5. The TV production is not especially claustrophobic, but similar to what he did on the Sontaran Experiment, and Earthshock, and even the Dominators, Marder likes to characterize the darkness as a living thing. Page 50, the Doctor and Ian in a tunnel, quote, "It was as though the mountain itself was a living thing that had swallowed them up. The noises they were hearing were its heartbeat and the workings of its mighty lungs." Or lungs, if you're Christopher Eccleston, I suppose. The Episode 1 cliffhanger falls on page 56, and that means that Episode 2 takes up the entire rest of the book, a full 84 pages, similar to the Sontaran Experiment book structure, come to think of it. On page 58, the Doctor doesn't know who Edgar Allan Poe is, which will change by the time we reach Evil of the Daleks in about 5 or 6 years of real time on the target novelization publication schedule. Chapter 6, page 68, Marder uses the word Arenicolous to refer to Sandy the Sand Beast. That's a $5 word right there. Arenicolous means, according to Merriam-Webster, quote, living, burrowing, or growing in sand. The death of the sand beast is horrific in standard martyr style, its death throes and charred corpse described in nauseating detail, most of which I won't read, except to say that its head resembles a, quote, smoldering, toffee-like blob. Ew. More importantly, with 84 pages of text to work with, Martyr greatly expands the second episode. His biggest change is to introduce the native Didoy before we meet them on TV. Vicky had referenced mysterious silvery figures in the previous paragraph, or in the previous chapter, I should say, and we meet those Didoy for the first time on pages 70 and 71. Quote, two tall, slim figures appeared on the ledge and slowly stared around themselves. The figures had long heads tapering to narrow jaws set on slender necks. Their features, if they had any, were mere pale smudges in the darkness, flat and smooth, with faintly sparkling flecks on the skin. Only their eyes showed clearly as large greenish gleams, almost perfectly circular. Their lithe bodies were encased in tightly fitting, single-piece suits made of a mirror-bright silver material, which incorporated supple boots and a kind of balaclava headgear. From the shoulders hung short multi-layered mantles made of the same material. The beings made no sound at all. Even their breathing, if indeed they did breathe, was inaudible. They turned to one another in a kind of graceful slow motion and seemed to communicate without speech. Having removed the mystery of whether or not Bennett is a bad guy, Martyr introduces a new mystery. Who are these figures? And he renders them only barely humanoid, much more alien than could have been realized in studio in 1964. Chapter 7 is short, but does stress the long-term danger that Vicky is in. The water is running short, and there will soon be an increasing radiation hazard due to the nature of the book-only rotating binary star. The planet will soon be caught directly between both suns. The Doctor in fact says that Barbara's slaying of the Sand Beast was a mercy killing, given what it soon had to look forward to. Chapter 8 upgrades Bennett's 20th century reel-to-reel tape recorder to what Martyr suspects will be a 25th century Laserdisc record. Nope. Checks notes. Laserdiscs wound up getting left behind in the 20th century too. Martyr solves the plot hole of why an interstellar space cruiser has a trap door in the floor of Bennett's quarters. Turns out the ship landed sideways, and that's an airlock door. Martyr removes Vicky's line about her mother being dead and replaces it with an in-depth exploration of the spacecraft, here called the Astra 9, as Ian prowls through the wreckage, mindful of the sort of radioactive leakage that was never mentioned on TV. The Doctor in the book comes not just from another planet, but, quote, another universe. Fanciful. Less fanciful is Martyr on page 84, adding an alternate explanation for Vicky's having left Earth, the ravages of global warming due to excessive carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, causing the polar ice caps to melt and ocean levels to rise in the far-off year 2024. 2493. Martyr was right, but he was too optimistic by about 470 years. Chapter 9 reaches the story's climax, the Doctor's brilliant confrontation with Coquillion, as Jeff and I discussed earlier. Problem: this happens before page 100, still with 40 pages of book left to fill. What's Martyr going to do? Well, he adds a sequence with Ian, Barbara, and Vicky being chased by the two silvery phantoms in a cat-and-mouse routine through portions of the vast colony ship wreckage, and introduces for the Doctor a museum exhibit displaying the Coquillion costume, which Martyr explains is a translation from the native Didoy language.
Come in, won't you? I've been waiting to talk to you. This used to be the People's Hall of Judgment. Fitting in the present circumstances, don't you think? Mr. Bennett, may I remind you that masks and robes such as you are wearing are only used on absolutely ceremonial occasions?
Are you finished?
Yes, I had hoped that you would continue. This elaborate plan must have been conceived for some reason. What?
To save my life, I killed a crew member on a spaceship to Astra. I was arrested The ship crashed. My crime hadn't been radioed to Earth. I knew if I could get rid of the other crew members.
Get rid of the other crew members and blame their deaths on the Dido people.
When we crash landed, the inhabitants invited us all to a grand meeting. It was simple. I just arranged an explosive. Using the ship's armaments, the whole thing went up. All the inhabitants, the crew, the whole race.
You destroyed a whole planet to save your own skin. You're insane.
The girl didn't know I'd been arrested. When we got back to Earth, she'd support my story. I dressed up as Caquillian to show her how terrible the people here were.
If that happened, your guilt would have been hidden forever.
If it happened? Nothing's changed. There's only 3 more people for Caquillian to kill, that's all.
Chapter 10. Exactly none of this happens on TV. There's a claustrophobic, long sequence in which Ian, Vicky, and Barbara stumble around in dark caverns and tunnels while trying to follow Caquillian to his eventually fatal encounter with the Doctor. There's that hideous glowing worm and its burrow full of the bones of its victims, and a lot of characters getting stuck in narrow passages. This is very reminiscent of Marder's first 2 novelizations, of The Ark in Space, episode 32 of this podcast, as well as Sontaran Experiment. None of this is suggested by the surviving scripts. This is Marder dipping into his favorite horror toolbox to add suspense and drama to get us to page 139, while adopting the story only half the length of your typical 4-part Doctor Who adventure. Chapter 11 picks up from the Chapter 9 Doctor vs. Bennett cliffhanger. Now, David Whittaker was an eloquent writer, capable of iambic pentameter in The Crusade, and some flowery Victorian-era dialogue in parts of Evil of the Daleks. Ian Marder, on the other hand, is the kind of guy who takes a Whittaker fight scene and adds the line, quote, page 108, "You'll just end up as a squashy skin bag full of jelly," says Bennett to the Doctor. Ew. But this is a funny fight scene, because it's written in the 1980s, and Marder, who had a sideline in writing novelizations of big-budget feature films, adds quips, action hero quips, like the Doctor quoting Thomas Dolby's "She blinded me" with science. Science! There's also a gorgeous continuity pun, page 110, the Doctor linking up Bennett's name with the Bennett oscillator, fictional technology ad-libbed by Tom Baker in The Ark in Space, after that serial's director. Ark in Space, as we said, was Marder's first Doctor Who novelization. Back to the jokey prose as Bennett tries to strangle the Doctor. He first offers a crazed James Bond villain justification for his initial murder on board the spaceship. The Doctor, page 112, quote, "went limp like a bundle of old clothes in a jumble sale." When the Didois show up and dispatch Bennett, they do so with more finality than the implied survivable fall off a cliff that Jeff mentioned earlier. They force him into a bottomless chasm using some godlike powers, with the book on page 113 likening them to gods. Chapters 12 and 13 are more Marder invention. 12 is a look sideways at Weinberger and Oliphant as their rescue mission approaches the planet Dido, and we shall not call Dido what a particular infamous Doctor Who off-license reference book in the 1990s called it, inserting a stray L into the word Dido in exactly the wrong place. Here we learn that rescuing, quote, a couple of castaways is not the rescue mission's true intent. Chapter 13 invents a scene in the caverns and tunnels where Vicky, Ian, and Barbara are chased by a glowing sandworm, perhaps a reference to Dune, or perhaps some Lovecraftian horror, but not Beetlejuice, which wouldn't have come out yet, and they discover a massive high-tech dead city at the bottom of a wide crater, and then follow the glowing silvery Didoy through more cramped tunnels and crevices, where they eventually find the TARDIS, quite by accident, and that links up to Chapter 14, which resumes the TV action, the charming scene where the Doctor invites Vicky aboard the TARDIS. The most notable Marder-only addition, a line you won't find in the camera script, is Ian suggesting, probably not entirely in jest, page 125, quote, "Let's take Vicky and leave the doctor behind." With chapter 15, we are back in Martyr Land, on board the quote-unquote rescue ship. Page 131 has expressly a Star Wars reference, although in story terms, referring to a crossword puzzle clue about Ronald Reagan's Star Wars, not George Lucas, a quote forceful cosmic umbrella arrangement. Later down the same page, Martyr tells us the rescue ship is made of, quote, Reaganium. Reagan was still president, both when this book was written and released. The geopolitics continue, as one of the rescue crewmen blamed the Chinese for their close encounter with the TARDIS. Page 134 references the planet Geldof, as in Bob. There's a bizarre allusion to the TARDIS emitting a monopole field, and what appears to be a suggestion that it's the TARDIS, or a TARDIS, that interfered with the Astra and caused it to crash in the first place. That's an idea I prefer to ignore. Interestingly, Martyr keeps the last scene, which leads directly into the Romans, complete with the TARDIS falling off the cliff, even though the Romans has already been novelized by Donald Cotton and did not open with references back to the rescue. I would be remiss in not pointing out that there's an epilogue. I don't like it. Really dark and cynical. It's the rescue crew's report, back to Earth, that the two Daidoi have been killed on sight without hesitation, quote, before any contact established. Then the sign-off, Happy Christmas, peace on earth, goodwill to all persons. Definitely a Ronald Reagan-era sentiment. This would have been at home in the New Adventures, a product of a specific moment in post-cancellation Doctor Who fandom, but it just doesn't belong here while the novelizations are still at their peak. Come on, give those last two surviving Daidoi a happy ending. And so, we reach the end of Ian Martyr's final book. The Rescue is in many ways a greatest hits compilation, harking back to his two earliest books in terms of continuity references and the way a two-part serial is expanded out with brand new material. There are pop culture references, and from the guy who recently wrote the spy thriller Harry Sullivan's War, geopolitical barbs. I didn't love the last 2 pages, but that's far outweighed by the rest of Ian Martyr's impressive body of work. As Jeff and I discussed earlier, Martyr died, offensively young, and it's unfair that we never got to see his 1990s output. Well, that about does her. Wraps her all up. The Rescue is not my favorite of his works, but it was a pretty good story, don't you think? Made me laugh to beat the band. Parts, anyway. Next time, on Doctor Who Literature, speaking of unhappy endings, we join Season 23, In Media Res, with the novelization of the 3rd part of the 4-part Trial of a Time Lord season. Jim Sangster is coming back to the show, and we're going to talk about Terror of the Vervoids, a Pip and Jane Baker novelization that opens with a massive spoiler for what happened in the middle of Trial of a Time Lord. The entire sequence, all 4 books, are published out of order. Very baffling decision. Caused some confusion for me when I was a young fan, but there's a lot of remarkable stuff about Terror of the Autons. We're also going to be seeing the return of Jim Sangster's compositions, musical compositions for this program. So I invite you back to join us next week for Doctor Who, Terror of the Vervoids. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. Our executive producer is David Barsky. This episode is produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode is written and edited by me. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Jeff Goddard from Gallifrey's Most Wanted. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.